The U.S. is sending a naval armada towards the Middle East. This is going to be towards the Mediterranean and the surrounding areas.
Is
Uh,
this a ship destroyer?
yeah, so we have aircraft carriers and we have a missile strike group. So this is typically used as backup to provide support for our airstrikes. So whenever we go and we airstrike a country, if we're going to heavily engage, we want to make sure that if that country retaliates, and in this case, we're focused on Iran. So if Iran decides to retaliate, we have a major air base in Qatar, we have other military bases in the Middle East. We have our naval strike package that can then counter Iran's attack. So whenever you see aircraft carriers, missile strike group, they start to head towards a certain direction, and there are what is perceived as imminent hostilities of a country, you know that there's a high probability, a high likelihood that the U.S. is going to then engage with that country in armed conflict or
This
warfare.
this is recent. How recent is this?
Yeah, so this actually, I don't remember if I don't know if you remember this, but last week there was a lot of talk for a few days about how the U.S. was going to imminently attack Iran because there were mass protests. I mean, the protests have been going on for a short period of time, but a little over a week. They've largely died down now because the Iranian government has come in to silence them, to suppress them. But when we were hearing on mainstream media news and independent media that you have these Iranian protests, they're starting fires, they're burning down fire engines. Only now have we figured out through the Jerusalem Post and the admittance of Mossad that Mossad was actually involved with those assets on the ground, and they were inciting on purpose to exacerbate a potential regime change, rather destabilization within the government. Uh, uh, for them, it didn't work out, right? So it's unfortunate for them, fortunate for a lot of other people who don't want to have a destabilization. It is true that the people of Iran, a large amount of people of Iran, they don't like the current regime. They don't like the Ayatollah because it is too theocratic. And because it's too theocratic, it is too strict in terms of policy, in terms of law. So they don't necessarily have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition their government. They don't have any of those rights that we have in the United States of America. And so it's true that they want a different leader and a different bureaucracy, but they don't want a large amount of them. They don't want that regime to come from a foreign entity, in this case, Israel, who would be implanting a let's say installed government or puppet government.
Is it because they're anti-Semitic?
Who? Which part?
Iran.
No, no. So what we have here is a reported 5,000 casualties in Iran. So live fire, mass arrests, internet blackouts, reported executions and threats. This is the crackdown that the Iranian government has implemented onto their people to silence these protests. Now, the 5,000 number, we don't know if that's accurate or not. The two sources that were initially reporting hundreds to thousands of people who have been executed, those two sources were either tied to Israeli media or to Washington, D.C. So, because there's already a bias there, there's an inherent bias. Not to say that we can't trust our intel community with anything. We can. You just have to make sure you corroborate the information. uh, you have to understand bias and make sure that you yourself are not prone to that bias, which could be propaganda in many cases, such as Operation Mockingbird, which is still ongoing to this day, allegedly. Now, at the same time, the Iranian government did come out, and I believe they reported that yes, there have been close to the amount that has been reported by DC and Israeli media of executions. Now, we don't know if that's accurate. Just because they're confessing it doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. It could be an intimidation factor. But nonetheless, 100% protesters, they do face the regime with negative consequences if they're going against the regime. Uh, they do want to have a new regime. They want to have a new administration, but they don't want it to come from an outside force. Reza Pahlavi, which is the son of the former Shah, who was overthrown in 1979, he has continuously been bolstered up by Israeli and just overall Western media. That is their asset. And Mossad has reported, or rather, the Israeli government has reported that they have been funding him. So that's how we know that he's essentially an asset for them. So the Iranian people, they didn't want him in, one, because they don't see him as a leader, two, well, he's being funded by an entity that they're not in favor of. So while they don't like their government, they're also not in favor of the Israeli government. So these are the items that they're looking at. So now what we're operating on is we are hearing reports, or rather, we did hear reports of, is Khamenei, is he hiding in a bunker? Is he potentially going to flee? Those were the questions that were being prompted because if you have these massive amount of protests and they're getting out of hand and the Iranian regime can't handle it, well, now we have a potential fleeing of a what is presumed to be a theological dictator,
Do you
which
think we would do a Venezuela 2.0 on the Iran leader?
go in and capture it.
Yeah.
Well, what occurred in Venezuela may be something separate in a sense that it was while we have our Delta Force and we should praise them by their covert and overt operations, this was too easy. Now,
Like the operation in Venezuela
yeah, the
was.
operation was too easy. Now, the justification of why it was too easy is we went in, we used basically an EMP. So this turned off all the electronics of the Venezuelan military, which is somewhat hard to believe because, yes, they're inferior to the US military, but that doesn't mean that they're living in the Stone Age necessarily. I mean, they are a country that has access to reserves while they have sanctions. They can sell those reserves, take that capital, and invest in certain technology. Um, what is considered as a perspective is that there was an agreement made behind the scenes with a certain part of the bureaucracy, so the Maduro bureaucracy, maybe even with Nicolas Maduro himself. So right now we have Delcy Rodriguez. She was the vice president. She's now the de facto acting president. So we didn't go in and regime change. We went in and through coercion, we don't know what the actual answer is, but through coercion, through financial means, through military might, one of those three, potentially other items, we have now persuaded Rodriguez to be on our side. And this is going to be along the lines of we're going to go in, we're going to extract oil reserves, we're going to have our US companies like an ExxonMobil, Chevron's already there. They're going to invest in infrastructure in these refineries. Venezuelan oil is much thicker than general oil we receive from around the world. So we have to build special refineries. And of course, the US taxpayer is going to have to.
Venezuelan girls are also much thicker.
Okay. So we would have to go in, refine the oil in a certain way. And after that, yes, we're going to send it back to the United States of America. I mean, this is obviously enhancing our value as a country because oil has value, but a certain amount of royalties will be given back as a kickback to the Venezuelan government. And so there was an agreement, most likely, that was made in that situation. When it comes to Iran, could a similar agreement be made because they do have oil reserves? Yes, but this is
So
now.
are we just going to every place on earth that has oil and we just give them some democracy?
That is a criticism that a lot of people make, yes. But there are different reasons why we go into the Middle East. Venezuela was a separate situation. Our U.S. foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East is based off of Israeli foreign policy. So since 1948, you have the inception of Israeli foreign policy. Actually, Israeli foreign policy was really created in 1917. That's from the Balfour Declaration. So this is Lord Rothschild from France making an agreement with England, and this is for the creation of a Jewish state. That Jewish state happened to be in what is now today Israel. And so that foreign policy was created. The most recent updated
So
policy.
that was the World War One when England was fighting France, and they created that.
England wasn't fighting France, but 1917. Yeah, that was at the end of the war. Yeah. So World War One was what 14 to 18. So that was close to the end of the war. Yeah.
Balfour is in England, right?
I'm not sure about that. I just know the name of the agreement. We can look it up later. So what we see with the Middle East is an updated foreign policy stemming from 1996, but off record, it has always existed. And so that's called the Clean Break Memo. So the U.S. military supports Israel, the state of Israel, and their military, the IDF, in terms of transforming the Middle East into something that Israel prefers, because there are hostile Arab nations to Israel. They want to reform that. Largely, they have reformed that. Iran is the last man standing. So while we may go in to extract resources, it's less about resources than it is about controlling the territory and having a more sympathetic government in favor of Israel, which, by the way, they had before in 1954 to 1979 with Mohammed, the Shah, Mohammed Reza Pahlavi. And he was favorable towards Israel, but he wasn't as favorable. And you had an internal revolution that went against him because they wanted more of a, I don't want to say them, well, I guess for lack of a better term, they wanted more of a theocratic government, less of a liberal Western democracy. They felt that the people felt that they were losing their roots. They also wanted to nationalize their oil industry. So you had a few things that were going against the Shah at the time, and he was eventually ousted. And so what we're seeing now is, are we going to have an imminent war with Iran? Is the United States of America going to initiate a conflict? Because that was the talk of the town the past week and a half. And we had to stop it because, well, the protests died down. We also didn't have our carrier strike group located in the region as naval backup. But now it's taken about a week for these carriers to get into position. Presumably, they're already in the area. And so now we have our Air Force ready to go. We have the IDF Air Force ready to go. We have our naval backup ready to go. The question is there a point of opportunity? Because if we go in and attack and the government is not unstable, we're really not going to be able to regime change. And there's also a separate question of should we even intervene and participate in a regime change? They are a sovereign country after all. Now, to initiate conflict, there are three items. This is part of the War Powers Resolution under the Nixon administration. One, Congress declares war. Two, Congress approves a military authorization. Three, Congress doesn't approve anything, but there's an imminent hostility where we have a lack of deliberation, and that allows the executive branch to act. Now, there are requirements of that. You must consult Congress before acting. You must notify them, or rather debrief them within 48 hours after the attack. If you have soldiers in the area, they have to be withdrawn within 60 days. If you need to extend that by 30 days for their safety, you're able to do so. So there are restrictions, requirements, prerequisites, and conditions, which typically the executive branch of any administration doesn't follow. Although if you look at the Afghanistan and Iraq war, we did gain congressional military authorization, but there's still a constitutional debate to be had over whether or not those conflicts were constitutional or not, lawful or not. I mean, every law has to fit within the parameters of the Constitution. So there is a question of should we even go and initiate attack against Iran, even if you don't like what they're doing in their country. They are a sovereign land, and the perspective similar to that, to show the empathetic side, would be if there are protests in this country for whatever reason, protests in the United States of America, and people are against a certain administration, does that now allow a foreign superpower to come in and use their might and state 40 to 60% of the country is upset about X, Y, and Z? We are a sovereign country in the United States of America. Does a foreign country have the ability, do they have the right, rather, to go in and do what they want, to intervene? Now, the American standard is no. So now that begs the question, do we have the right, as the United States of America, to do the same thing that we just said no to onto a foreign land? Now, of course, the trope is might makes right, and that's really just about force. That doesn't mean it's okay or ethical or moral. That's just the reality. That's a pragmatic understanding of leverage and power. But we have to understand the principle of, do we have the right to do something, and should we do something? And should we do it, especially if it's in the interests of a foreign entity, while on paper they may be an ally? How does that help the American people, right? So potentially we are seeing an imminent attack onto Iran, but the opportunity is really at what leaders are looking at. So leadership, Trump came out, there's a report.
Is Trump the leader of the United States?
On paper, he is. So he came out and he stated, well, actually not him personally, but reports regarding his cabinet and his administration, it stated Trump was considering options to go against Iran, but he wanted to go in and out. He didn't want to make this a prolonged ordeal. He didn't want to enter a new conflict, a new war that would cause more casualties. There would be collateral. He wants to go in, go out. So similar to the first incident against Iran back in June, I want to say it was June. So you had Israeli airstrikes. They came in. Iran anticipated that then the United States of America would come in. So they kicked out the International Atomic Energy Agency, which had eyes on Iran's weapon systems. Because of the attacks, now we have less information that we're gathering. You also had the Israeli government using the International Atomic Energy Agency to spy on Iranians, and that information would then be disseminated to the Israelis, when really it's not supposed to be disseminated. It's just an audit of the weapon system to make sure that they're not procuring nuclear weapons. And then, of course, we had our B-2 stealth bombers come in, attack Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan, and we have no true confirmation of their uranium, of their other nuclear power plants, other nuclear facilities. We don't have 100% definitive confirmation. I'm saying this from the public point of view. Perhaps the White House and the Pentagon, the National Security Council, they're privy to that information. We are not. But now we're going in a second time. even though we stated at that point in time we would not go in again. So it went from they're building a nuclear threshold, 60% at the time, to they have a ballistic missile program, which was a threat to Israel. So during the 12-day war, you had infrastructure in Haifa and in Tel Aviv that were hit dramatically, substantially. And there weren't enough interceptor missiles. I mean, the Iron Dome in Israel. So you have the Iron Dome, you have David Sling, you have Arrow. They were using the Iron Dome for short range interception. The Iron Dome was not able to capture all of the missiles because a lot of them were hypersonic, meaning they're moving faster than the speed of sound. But in relative terms, they're moving faster than the interceptor missiles can catch them at. And Israel was also running out of interceptor missiles. So they needed to restructure, restock, and rebuild. That's where you had the United States come in to build a type of cessation of firing. And so now they have gone from nuclear armament to ballistic missile program to they're having protests in their street. And again, we can't confirm or deny certain information, like thousands of people are executed, but that's a sovereign issue. So that's not to say we're advocating for it. Of course, the theocratic regime, if we're using the individual rights point of view, the individual rights standard, is not just in a type of there's no justice in that type of society where you're praising people to be free, praising for people to be able to criticize their government, people being able to reform their government, in fact. And so now we're awaiting what could occur in the next week or so. And if it doesn't occur in the next week or so, keep in mind you have a lot of these leaders, such as Netanyahu, who are, well, Netanyahu in particular, he's facing corruption and bribery as criminal charges in Israel. There are a large amount of Israelis who are against Netanyahu. They want to have a different leader because, in their perspective, he has led them to more war, and there have been attacks on Israel. Clearly, I just mentioned a few. So he definitely has an incentive to push for war sooner rather than later. This is not only to extend so that he doesn't have to face trial, he can remain as a status quo prime minister, but also to further progress with the clean break memo and the agenda of the Greater Israel Project. So these are overt public policies by the state of Israel. Even if you ask a lot of Israelis, a lot of them are for it, obviously, because they live in Israel, they're Israeli. But this is the agenda that's at hand. And the question we should ask is, should we be in Iran? Should we initiate or intervene? How else can we go in or persuade, maybe from a societal or cultural point of view, to where the regime can have a different bureaucracy? Because it's not just one person you have to worry about. It's the entire bureaucracy. If you get rid of one person, two people, three people, I mean, there are still people who have a similar ideology. They're still going to replace that individual or those individuals. And maybe it's not going to be the exact same type of ruling, but it'll be similar in nature. And so this is what people are concerned about, that our U.S. taxpaying dollars are going towards these foreign wars where we're sold, maybe lies, maybe not, but we're sold an idea, we're sold a narrative, and the American people maybe are fear-mongered, maybe are told that this is the patriotic way to engage in these situations overseas. Whereas if you compare that with China, do we believe that China doesn't like a lot of things that are occurring in the world? Of course. They're going to have their priorities. They're going to be focused on their nations, their ideology. But what China has decided to do is, instead of destruction, where there's a lot of benefit in the pipelines of where the money is going, they have decided to reinvest in their infrastructure. So if you look at Chongqing, if you look at Shanghai, if you look at Beijing, I don't know much if they've reduced their pollution. I'll presume so, at least a little bit. They still have a lot of pollution, and they still create a lot of trash, and they don't know how to dispose of that properly. They also have a poor public water system. But in terms of their infrastructure of their buildings, which we don't know if they're truly quality, if we can trust them compared to what UAE is building in Dubai, but they're reinvesting in their own infrastructure so that their own people can enjoy the cities that they live in. And so they look actually very magical. Obviously, we have shared pictures, imagery of what's occurring in China, and we see that some of these cities, you could be sitting. Here's an example. I don't remember what the city was. Maybe it was Chongqing. Maybe it was some other city. But you're sitting, and it's kind of like this open amphitheater. It's like a restaurant. And there are these stairs that go down. So it's almost like on a gradient hill. And you see the entire city in the background. and it looks fantastic, right? So we could have that in America. Um, for example, we have potholes. Now that's a local issue. Property tax would have to fix that. But whether it's potholes, whether it's schools, whether it's poor schooling in terms of education, like the information you're receiving, uh, whether it's better telecommunications, better energy companies, better public water treatment, as an example. I mean, just basic infrastructure. If you compare us to a Japan or a China in the more developed areas, or a UAE like in Dubai or even Abu Dhabi, I mean, we should be miles ahead. We have the highest GDP out of all the nations. Yes, we're in a lot of debt, and we're able to export our inflation because we print fiat currency by creating strong demand for the US dollar. But while we're in the situation we're in now, because this may not last forever, there are going to be different countries that move up and down in the hierarchy. We should want to secure ourselves. I mean, Dubai is looking at their city and they're saying, hey, in a few hundred years, we may run lower on oil. So let's spend a huge amount of capital that we have access to right now to reinvest and make this a safe city that has all these amenities, conveniences. It's beneficial to business owners. Let's invite people into our city and create this new type of international commerce. And we can benefit from that. So even if we go forward 1,000 years and we're no longer relying on oil, let's say there's renewable energy everywhere, at least we're still going to be a major city. And it's going to be a city that people want to go to, right? Singapore is another example of that. Singapore used to be big, now it's Dubai. But I would argue a lot of them have similarities. I mean, you go to Singapore, obviously it's an authoritarian regime, but it's clean, it's safe, you can do business there. The threat is China. China's right there. So if China ever wants to intervene, they would have the utmost power to intervene. For Dubai, it's Israel is in the Middle East, obviously, granted it's on the other side, but that would be a threat. So when we saw the attack, Israeli airstrikes from obviously Israel to Doha, Qatar, the capital of Qatar, that was a not just a warning signal, but a type of um, concerning behavior to the Gulf nations. Because if you're able to go and attack Qatar is a developed country, Doha is a developed country, um, and if Israel is able to go and attack Doha, Qatar, and there's no retaliation, I mean, in theory, the United States of America is supposed to protect Qatar from any country, even if they're another ally. But there was no protection that was made. So now these Gulf nations are kind of on their toes, and there's something that they built there that could be heavily disrupted. And what we're seeing is a destabilization. I mean, we've had destabilization in that region for decades, but now it's affecting the more developed countries. And so for us as Americans, it tells us that first off, we want better infrastructure in our society. But it also tells us there needs to be less destabilization, less intervention, because when we go in and we intervene, we end up creating a worse problem for the future. And when we do that, it can come back on our US soil, as we saw with 9/11. And now that puts everyone's lives, American lives, or people who are here lawfully, it puts them at risk. Um, so a lot of people are now anti-interventionists. They're anti-war. Uh, that is what people are pursuing in this country because they see that perhaps American interests are not really being catered to. Perhaps these interests are for military contractors or recipients of the Federal Reserve or for certain political actors. And it doesn't really help the general populace. And so I'm not saying that we need to transform into the UAE or to China or to any other example you want to use in the world. But what I am saying is that there are certain items we can pull back on. And because we've pulled back on that, yes, there's a financial savings to that, which we can reinvest. But there's also an ideological savings, an effort savings. If we're doing, if we're participating in 20 different conflicts, small, large, proxy, that is time and effort and focus that we're not putting into something else that could be progression of innovation or progression of our society. And so the question is now, is anything going to happen in the next week? If not, it's still on the table. Something as soon as there's a margin of opportunity that's open for the US military in tandem with the Israeli Defense Force, as per both of our foreign policies, to go into Iran, which they see as if you watch Inception at the end, there's a totem that Leonardo DiCaprio spins. and that totem starts to wiggle at the end. So you don't know if he's in a dream or not, but it starts to wiggle at the end. So that's kind of like a stable regime becoming unstable or destabilized. Once it becomes destabilized, it's easier to knock it over. So that's typically what large superpowers have done throughout history. They identify these regimes that can be destabilized, that are vulnerable, and then when there's an opportune point, they go in, they extract resources, they install puppet regimes, and it's no different here. And it's all about conquest to some degree, rather than they're a sovereign country, let them operate as they will. Yes, there are going to be items that we don't like, but if we're going to have this artificial creation that humans have created ideologically, conceptually, of you're a sovereign territory, and we're deeming you a sovereign territory. So whatever you do, we're not going to intervene, and vice versa. Whatever we do, we don't want you to intervene. If we're going to violate that, now we're in a type of moral predicament, and we really don't have any justification if a justification against if other countries decide to do the same. So, for example, we went to Venezuela, we captured Nicolas Maduro. Well, Russia and China now have an incentive. China can look at Taiwan. You guys did it. Why can't we do it? Russia comes in, they say, look, you guys did it. Why can't we do it to Ukraine? Again, not to advocate for them to do it, but they're going to see what we're doing and they're going to take it as, okay, you guys are doing it. They don't have sovereignty. Might makes right. Well, we're the mightiest in this region of the world. We have the ability to capture. Um, and so now that puts everyone in a precarious situation.
That was a lot, but I will go in it with a little different perspective. So I like to watch a lot of these war and military movies or shows in general. And now I would say things have changed for the majority of the people since the creation of social medias, where now we get to communicate with everyone else a lot easier on a scale that was impossible before. And a lot of these movies that I like to watch, they generally, now some of them are based on the war that we have already participated in, and some of them are in today's time and in today's political, you know, let's say sentiments. And the usual suspect is U.S. military will work with Israel, Mossad intelligence, and
Also,
they,
MI6.
yeah, some of that, but usually the common culprit or the common enemies are usually Iran and the Middle Eastern regions, and the themes are sort of about how Iran is very close to achieving nuclear weapons, and so we are now having this military operations to stop them. Top Gun, the Maverick one, even the
Well, in Jack Ryan, they mentioned Venezuela.
Jack Ryan, and then even the one I've been seeing, which is with Chris Pratt, the what is it called? The terminal, the terminal. I think that's what it's called. Terminal.
Never heard of it.
It's recent, is on Amazon. And so all of these movies, and this is all the new ones and the ones they've been doing for a long time in the past, it's usually around the same theme. And they do it because they want to prep the American people, or brainwash, that's another word, the American people into believing this paradigm of how the Americans are the good guys and we work with the other good guy, which is usually IDF, and we are trying to prevent some type of global, nuclear war that is about to happen with all of the enemies in the Middle East region, like Iran, because of these, military grade weapons that they have, or nuclear weapons that they're potentially going to have. And so we do these joint operations, or maybe just American operations, and we are trying to prevent these, World War III that is going to happen. That is usually how it's being portrayed in a lot of these movies. So that
I
is
mean, I mean, what you should say is it's black and white, when in reality there's a lot more gray.
right, but they do it on purpose because they understand that they have to get people behind the movement, or
But that's every country. Every country is
every
going to do
country
that.
do that, I suppose. I suppose you're right on that. And so, but a lot of times people don't understand that. People don't realize they have been slowly programmed to believe a certain narrative on the world. Now, every country does that, but I suppose in America, at least, we have the freedom, for the most part, to discuss these things so that people get to realize we are actually being told a lie on how things are in the world. And
Well, this is why being able to disseminate information and receive information without restriction, without censorship, and be able to do your own critical thinking and due diligence is of the utmost importance. Because if you can't do any of that, if you can't receive the information, if you can't put out the information, if you can't think for yourself, then you're not going to be able to have access to whatever the truth is in a balance of probabilities.